The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Lena Hallbrook stood in the dusty front room of the ranch house holding the envelope like it might bite her. Outside, the September wind scraped across the high desert, pulling tumbleweeds past the fence line and rattling the barn doors. The sound was lonely. Everything about this place felt lonely now. She already knew what the letter said before she opened it. You didn't get mail from the Durango Bank and Trust with good news tucked inside. Her fingers trembled as she tore the seal. Final notice. 3 days to settle outstanding debt of $3,847, or the property will be seized and sold at auction to recover funds owed. 3 days. Lena read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. They didn't. She folded the letter carefully, set it on the table beside her father's old tobacco tin, and walked to the window. The ranch spread out before her, 400 acres of scrub and stone, a herd of cattle too small to be profitable, a barn that needed new boards, and a house that creaked in the wind like an old man's bones. It wasn't much, but it was hers, or it had been. Her father, Samuel Hallbrook, had died 6 months ago. Heart gave out while he was mending fence on the north pasture. Lena found him there, slumped against a post, his hat still on his head. He'd worked himself to death trying to keep this place running, and now she was about to lose it anyway. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass. It was cool, almost cold. Winter was coming early this year. She could feel it. Behind her, the floor creaked. "You gonna stand there all day, or you gonna tell me what it says?" Lena turned. Rosa Martinez stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a sturdy woman in her 50s, with gray streaking through her black hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd worked for the Hallbrooks since before Lena was born, cook, housekeeper, and the closest thing to a mother Lena had left. 3 days, Lena said quietly. "They're giving me 3 days." Rosa's face didn't change, but something tightened around her mouth. "Your brother?" "No word." "Damn fool." Rosa crossed the room and took the letter from the table, scanning it quickly. Her jaw worked as she read. "He promised you that money, Lena. He swore on your father's grave." "I know." "So where the hell is he?" Lena shook her head. "I don't know, Rosa. I sent 3 telegrams. Nothing." Her brother, Nathaniel, had left for Denver 2 months ago with a plan to sell some mining equipment their father had left behind. Good equipment, worth real money. He'd promised to send the proceeds back within the month, more than enough to cover the loan. But the month had come and gone, and then another. And now the bank was calling in the debt, and Nathaniel was God knows where, probably drunk in some saloon with empty pockets and empty promises. Rosa set the letter down with a sharp snap. "Then we fight." "Fight how?" "I don't have the money, Rosa. I've sold everything I can sell. The cattle aren't worth enough, the land's mortgaged to the roof, and the bank won't give me another extension. I already tried." "Then we go to the bank again. Today. Right now." Lena wanted to believe that would work. She wanted to believe that if she walked into that cold marble building and spoke reasonably, calmly, that someone would listen. But she'd already tried that. Twice. The bank manager, a thin man named Horace Burnham with wire-rimmed glasses and the warmth of a January frost, had looked at her like she was a child asking for candy. "Miss Hallbrook, sentiment doesn't pay debts. Your father overextended himself. That's not the bank's problem. If you can't meet your obligations, we'll find someone who can." Someone. She knew exactly who that someone was. Silas Crowley. The name sat in her mind like a stone in her boot, constant, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. Crowley owned half the valley already. He'd been buying up failing ranches for years, piece by piece, until his empire stretched from the Animas River to the San Juan Mountains. And now he wanted hers. He'd made an offer 3 weeks ago, a lowball offer, insulting in its arrogance. Lena had turned him down flat. 2 days later, the bank called in her loan. Coincidence? Not a chance. "I'll go," Lena said finally. "But it won't change anything." Rosa's expression softened. She reached out and squeezed Lena's shoulder. "Then we'll figure something else out. We always do." But the confidence in Rosa's voice sounded thin, stretched tight over doubt. The ride into Durango took an hour. Lena saddled her father's old bay mare, a steady animal named Bess, and set out under a sky the color of lead. The road was dry and rutted, cutting through miles of sagebrush and pine. In the distance, the San Juan Mountains rose like a wall, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Durango was a rough town, built on silver and cattle and the railroad that cut through its heart. The streets were wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted buildings and boardwalks crowded with miners, ranchers, drifters, and women in calico dresses. Wagons rattled past, and somewhere a dog barked. Lena tied Bess to the hitching post outside the bank and stepped inside. The interior was all dark wood and polished brass, designed to intimidate. It worked. Lena felt small the moment she crossed the threshold. Horace Burnham sat behind a large desk near the back, reviewing a ledger. He didn't look up when she approached. "Mr. Burnham." He made a mark in the ledger, then set his pen down with deliberate slowness. When he finally looked at her, his expression was as warm as a tombstone. "Miss Halbrook, I assume you're here about the notice?" "I am." "Then I'll save us both some time. The bank's position hasn't changed. You have 3 days to settle the debt, or the property will be seized." Lena forced herself to stay calm. "I need an extension. Just 2 more weeks. My brother is sending money from Denver." "Your brother?" Burnham's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Yes, I've heard about your brother. A reliable man, I'm sure." The sarcasm stung, but Lena pushed past it. "He had complications with the sale, but the money's coming. I just need a little more time." "Time," Burnham repeated, as if the word amused him. "Miss Halbrook, the bank has been extraordinarily patient. Your father missed 2 payments before he died. You've missed 3 since. We've extended you more courtesy than most borrowers receive. My father built that ranch from nothing. He worked himself to death to—" "And that's very tragic," Burnham interrupted, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "However, tragedy doesn't change the terms of the loan. You owe the bank money. You don't have it. The matter is closed." Lena felt heat rising in her chest. "This isn't about the loan. This is about Silas Crowley. He wants my land, so you're squeezing me out." Burnham's eyes went cold. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth. Mr. Crowley is a valued client of this bank. He's also a man of considerable influence in this territory. If I were you, I'd be very careful about slandering him." "I'm not slandering anyone. I'm stating facts." Burnham leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach. "Miss Halbrook, I understand you're upset. Losing a family property is difficult. But you're a young woman, unmarried, no male relatives to speak of, trying to run a cattle ranch in one of the harshest climates in Colorado. It's simply not practical. Perhaps it's time to accept that some things aren't meant to be." The condescension in his voice made her teeth ache. She wanted to grab the ledger off his desk and throw it at his smug face, but that wouldn't help. Nothing would help. She took a breath, steadying herself. "If I bring you the money in 3 days, the loan is cleared? If you bring the full amount, $3,847 plus the accumulated interest, then yes, the loan will be satisfied." "Fine." She turned and walked out before he could say anything else. Outside, the afternoon sun was bright and harsh. Lena stood on the boardwalk, blinking against the glare, her heart pounding. 3 days. She didn't have $3,847. She didn't have half that. And Nathaniel, damn him, wasn't coming. She was going to lose the ranch. The realization settled over her like a weight, pressing down on her shoulders, her chest, her lungs. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. But neither of those things would change anything. So instead, she untied Bess and swung into the saddle. As she turned the horse toward home, a voice called out behind her. "Miss Halbrook?" She turned. A man stood on the boardwalk outside the saloon, leaning against the post with the easy posture of someone who'd spent a lifetime on the trail. He was tall, lean, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of worn denim. His hat was dusty, his boots scuffed, and he wore a gun on his hip like it belonged there. "Do I know you?" Lena asked. The man pushed off the post and walked toward her. His movements were smooth, unhurried. "Name's Rhett Calder. I knew your brother." Lena's stomach dropped. "Nathaniel?" "That's right." "Where is he?" Rhett stopped a few feet from her horse, his expression unreadable. Dead. The word hit her like a fist. What? Bar fight in Denver 3 weeks ago. He pulled a knife on the wrong man. Lena stared at him, trying to process the words. Nathaniel was dead. Her brother, stupid, reckless, infuriating Nathaniel, was dead. He owed me money, Rhett continued, his tone matter-of-fact. $500. Before he died, he told me about your situation. Said if anything happened to him, I should come here. Said maybe we could work something out. Lena's mind was spinning. Work what out? Rhett glanced around, then back at her. Not here. Somewhere private. I don't even know you. No, you don't. But your options are running thin, Miss Halbrook, and I'm offering you one. Lena wanted to tell him to go to hell. She wanted to ride away and never look back. But something in his eyes stopped her. Not pity, not sympathy, just a calm, steady certainty. The ranch, she said slowly, 2 miles north of town. If you're lying to me, I'm not. He said it simply, without defensiveness or bravado, just a statement of fact. Lena nodded once, then turned Bess and rode away. Behind her, Rhett Calder watched her go, then untied his own horse, a big roan gelding, and followed at a distance. Lena reached the ranch just as the sun was starting to dip toward the mountains. Rosa was in the kitchen when she walked in, kneading dough for bread. She took one look at Lena's face and stopped. What happened? Nathaniel's dead. Rosa's hand stilled. Dios mío. Bar fight in Denver, 3 weeks ago. Lena pulled off her hat and tossed it onto the table. And there's a man on his way here. Says Nathaniel owed him money. Says he wants to talk. About what? I don't know. Rosa wiped her hands on her apron, her expression wary. You think he's trouble? I think everyone's trouble right now. A few minutes later, hoofbeats sounded outside. Lena walked to the window and saw Rhett Calder riding up the long drive, his silhouette dark against the fading light. She met him on the porch. Rhett dismounted, tied his horse, and climbed the steps. Up close, he looked older than she'd first thought. Maybe 35, maybe 40. Hard to tell. The years on the trail had a way of aging a man. Thank you for seeing me, he said. I haven't decided if I'm going to yet. A faint smile touched his mouth. Fair enough. What do you want, Mr. Calder? He looked past her, toward the barn and the pasture beyond. Your brother told me about this place, said it was in trouble, said you were about to lose it. And? And I'm offering to help. Lena crossed her arms. Why? Because I need work, and you need help. I don't have money to pay you. I'm not asking for money. Then what are you asking for? Rhett met her eyes. A partnership. I put in the work, help you save the ranch. In return, I get a stake. 20% of the profits once we're clear of the debt. Lena stared at him. You're out of your mind. Maybe, but I'm also your best chance. I don't even know you. No, Rhett agreed. But you know your brother's gone. You know the bank's coming for your land in 3 days. And you know you don't have the money to stop them. He paused. I do. Lena's heart skipped. What? I have money. Not enough to cover the whole debt, but enough to buy us time. We sell what we can, consolidate the herd, and make a run to the railroad depot in Silverton. If we move fast, we can turn enough profit to settle with the bank. That's insane. Silverton's a 2-day drive through mountain passes. The weather's turning. We'd lose half the herd. Or you lose everything. The words hung between them, brutal and true. Lena looked away, her jaw tight. Why would you risk your money on this? Because I'm tired of drifting. I've spent 20 years moving from job to job, place to place, never putting down roots. Your brother told me about this ranch, and I thought... He trailed off, then shrugged. Maybe it's time to stop running. Lena studied him, searching for the lie. But all she saw was a tired man with steady eyes and a dangerous kind of calm. If I say yes, she said slowly, you follow my lead. This is my ranch, my rules. Agreed. And if you cross me, I'll put a bullet in you myself. Rhett's smile was thin but genuine. I believe you. Lena extended her hand. 3 days, Mr. Calder. Let's see what you're made of. Rhett shook her hand. His grip was firm, calloused, and warm. 3 days, he echoed. And just like that, the game began. They started before dawn the next morning. Rhett moved through the ranch with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 100 times before. He walked the property, counted the cattle, inspected the barn and the equipment, and made notes in a small leather journal he kept in his coat pocket. Lena watched him from the porch, coffee in hand, trying to decide if she'd just made the best or worst decision of her life. By mid-morning, Rhett had a plan. "We've got 73 head," he said, spreading a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table. "Most of them are in decent shape, but 12 are too young or too weak to make the drive. We sell those locally, fast, at a loss if we have to, and use that money to buy supplies. Then we take the rest to Silverton." "That's 50 miles through rough country," Lena said. 52, actually, but it's doable. In good weather, maybe, but look at the sky." Rhett glanced toward the window. The clouds were low and dark, pressing down on the mountains like a lid. "We don't have time to wait for good weather. If we get caught in a storm, we won't." "You don't know that." "No," Rhett admitted, "but I know if we sit here, you lose everything, so we move." Lena looked at Rosa, who stood by the stove, her arms crossed. The older woman's face was unreadable. "What do you think?" Lena asked. Rosa was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I think you don't have a choice." Lena turned back to Rhett. "Fine, we move, but I'm coming with you." "Not necessary. I can handle—" "This is my ranch, Mr. Calder. I'm coming." Rhett held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But you follow my lead on the trail. No arguments." "Agreed." "Good. Then let's get to work. On." The next 2 days were a blur of motion. They sold the weak cattle to a neighboring rancher for half what they were worth, but it gave them enough cash to buy provisions: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition. Rhett hired 2 hands from town, drifters looking for quick work, and together they rounded up the herd and prepared for the drive. Lena worked alongside them, her hands blistering from rope burns, her back aching from long hours in the saddle. But she didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford. On the 3rd morning, the day the bank notice was due, they set out before dawn. The herd moved slowly at first, the cattle skittish and reluctant, but Rhett kept them moving, his voice calm and steady, and gradually the animals settled into a rhythm. Lena rode near the front, her eyes scanning the horizon. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks shrouded in mist. Somewhere up there, the weather was turning. She could feel it. "We'll make camp at Cascade Creek tonight," Rhett said, riding up beside her. "That puts us halfway to Silverton. If we push hard tomorrow, we'll make it before the storm hits. And if we don't, then we dig in and wait it out." Lena looked at him. "You're awfully calm for a man gambling everything on a cattle drive." Rhett's mouth twitched. "I've gambled on worse." "Like what?" "Like trusting your brother." Despite herself, Lena almost smiled. They rode in silence for a while, the sound of hoofbeats and lowing cattle filling the air. The land around them was stark and beautiful, rolling hills covered in sagebrush, stands of pine and aspen, and the distant glint of a river cutting through the valley. "Why did you really come here?" Lena asked suddenly. Rhett glanced at her. "I told you, I needed work." "You could get work anywhere. Why here?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Your brother talked about you, said you were stubborn, said you'd never give up even when you should. And I wanted to see if he was right." "What's your verdict?" Rhett looked at her, and for the first time she saw something like respect in his eyes. "I think he was right." Before Lena could respond, one of the hired hands shouted from the rear of the herd, "Rider coming in fast!" Lena turned, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle strapped to her saddle. A lone horseman was galloping toward them, kicking up dust. As he drew closer, Lena recognized him. Tom Grayson, one of Crowley's men. Her stomach tightened. Grayson pulled up hard, his horse snorting and stamping. He was a big man, thick-shouldered, with a face like a slab of granite. "Miss Halbrook," he said, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. "What do you want, Grayson?" "Mr. Crowley sent me. He heard you were making a drive to Silverton. Wanted me to pass along a message." I'm not interested in anything Crowley has to say. Grayson's smile didn't reach his eyes. He thinks you're making a mistake. Says the weather's turning bad. Says you'd be smart to turn around, head back to Durango, and take his offer while it's still on the table. Tell Crowley he can go to hell. Grayson's smile vanished. You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Halbrook. So is he. The tension stretched tight between them. Grayson's hand drifted toward the gun on his hip, and Lena's fingers tightened on her rifle. Then Rhett nudged his horse forward, positioning himself between Lena and Grayson. I think the lady made herself clear, Rhett said quietly. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. You've delivered your message. Now, move along. Grayson looked at Rhett, sizing him up. Whatever he saw made him hesitate. This isn't over, Grayson said finally. No, Rhett agreed. It's not. Grayson wheeled his horse around and rode off, disappearing over the ridge. Lena let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. That was a warning, she said. I know. He's going to make a move. Probably. Lena looked at Rhett. You're not worried? Worrying doesn't change anything. We keep moving. And they did. Heat. They reached Cascade Creek just as the sun was setting. The campsite was a flat stretch of ground near the water, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. The cattle spread out along the creek, drinking and grazing, while the men set up camp. Lena sat by the fire, her body aching, her mind racing. Tomorrow they'd push for Silverton. If they made it, they'd have a chance. If they didn't, she didn't let herself finish the thought. Rhett sat down across from her, handing her a tin cup of coffee. You did good today, he said. I'm not dead yet. That's something. Rhett smiled faintly. It's more than something. They sat in silence, watching the fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows across the camp. Can I ask you something? Lena said. Go ahead. What happened to you before all this? Rhett took a sip of coffee, his expression thoughtful. Nothing worth talking about. I drifted, worked ranches, drove cattle, took odd jobs, never stayed anywhere long. Why not? Because staying meant putting down roots, and roots meant getting hurt when things fell apart, which they always did. So you just gave up? Not gave up, just stopped trying. Lena studied him. And now? Now I'm here, trying again. He looked at her. Maybe that's stupid, but your brother said something before he died. He said, if I broke every promise, let someone else keep what I threw away. I think he was talking about you, about this place. Lena's throat tightened. He didn't throw me away. No, but he left you to fight alone, and that's almost the same thing. The words stung, but they weren't wrong. I'm glad you came, Lena said quietly. Rhett nodded. So am I. The storm hit an hour before dawn. Lena woke to the sound of thunder rolling across the mountains and rain hammering against her bedroll. She scrambled to her feet, pulling on her coat and hat, and ran toward the herd. The cattle were spooked, milling and bawling, their eyes wide with fear. The hired hands were already moving, trying to keep the animals from stampeding. Get them turned! Rhett shouted over the wind. Push them toward the trees! Lena swung into the saddle and rode hard, her horse slipping in the mud. The rain was cold and relentless, soaking through her clothes, blurring her vision. Lightning split the sky, and thunder cracked like a gunshot. It took an hour to settle the herd. By the time the storm started to ease, Lena was shaking with cold and exhaustion, but they hadn't lost a single head. Rhett rode up beside her, water streaming off the brim of his hat. You all right? I've been better. We need to keep moving. We're losing time. Lena nodded, too tired to argue. They drove the herd through the mud and rain, fighting for every mile. The trail was treacherous, the cattle slow and stubborn, but Rhett pushed them forward, relentless, and Lena pushed with him. By late afternoon, the rain stopped, and ahead through the mist, Lena saw the lights of Silverton. They'd made it. No. The cattle pens at the railroad depot were crowded, but the buyer was waiting. A wiry man named Fletcher with sharp eyes and a calculating smile. "73 head," he said, walking among the cattle. "Not bad. Not great, but not bad." "They're good stock," Lena said. "Healthy, strong." "Maybe. I'll give you $18 a head." 25. Fletcher laughed. "You're dreaming, girl." 22. He looked at her, then at Rhett, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed. Something in Rhett's expression made Fletcher reconsider. 20, Fletcher said finally. Lena glanced at Rhett. He nodded. "Deal." They shook hands, and Fletcher counted out the money in cash, $1,460. It wasn't enough to cover the full debt, but it was close. "We'll need to find another buyer," Rhett said as they walked away. "One more sale, and we're clear." Lena's mind was already racing. "There's a timber outfit outside town. They need beef for their camp. If we can—" "We can," Rhett said. "Trust me." And for the first time in a long time, Lena did. They struck a deal with the timber boss that evening, a gruff man named Henriksen who agreed to take 10 head at premium prices in exchange for quick delivery. It wasn't much, but combined with the money from Silverton, it was enough. By the time they rode back into Durango 3 days later, Lena had $3,902 in her saddlebag. Enough to pay the bank. Enough to save the ranch. She walked into Horace Burnham's office with her head high and dropped the money on his desk. "Every cent," she said, "with interest." Burnham stared at the bills, then at her. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely surprised. "Well," he said slowly, "it seems you've proven me wrong, Miss Halbrook." "Yes," Lena said. "I have." She turned and walked out, Rhett at her side. Outside, the sun was shining. The air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in months, Lena felt like she could breathe. "We did it," she said. Rhett smiled. "You did it." "No, we did." They stood there for a moment, side by side, two people who'd gambled everything and won. But deep down, Lena knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And somewhere in the shadows, Silas Crowley was watching, waiting, planning his next move. Because men like Crowley didn't lose gracefully, and this fight was far from over. The victory lasted exactly 4 days. Lena stood in the barn, pitchfork in hand, mucking out stalls while the morning sun slanted through the gaps in the boards. The air smelled of hay and horses and honest work. For the first time in months, the weight on her chest had lifted. The ranch was hers. The debt was paid. She could breathe again. Rhett was in the north pasture, checking fence lines with one of the hands they'd kept on after the drive. Rosa was in the house, humming as she kneaded bread. The rhythm of the ranch had returned, steady and familiar, like a heartbeat finding its pace again. Lena drove the pitchfork into the straw and paused, wiping sweat from her forehead. Through the open barn door, she could see the mountains rising in the distance, their peaks white against the blue sky. Beautiful. Harsh. Unforgiving. Just like everything else out here. She was about to return to work when she heard hoofbeats. Fast. Urgent. Lena stepped out of the barn, shading her eyes against the sun. A rider was coming up the drive, his horse lathered and breathing hard. As he got closer, she recognized him. Billy Tate, a young ranch hand who worked for the Hendersons, a family that ran a spread about 10 miles east. Billy pulled up hard, nearly falling out of the saddle. "Miss Halbrook." Lena caught his arm, steadying him. "Billy, what's wrong?" "It's the Hendersons. Their water's been cut off. Someone dammed up the creek that feeds their property. Livestock's dying. They tried to clear it, but there were men waiting, armed men." Lena's stomach dropped. "Who?" "Crowley's men." The name hit her like a fist. She should have known, should have expected this. "Is anyone hurt?" "Not yet, but Mr. Henderson sent me to warn the other ranchers. He says Crowley's making a move, says if we don't stand together, he'll pick us off one by one." Lena's jaw tightened. "Where's your father now?" "At the ranch, trying to figure out what to do. But, Miss Halbrook, he's scared. We all are." "Tell him I'm coming. Tell him to gather anyone who'll listen. We meet tonight at his place." Billy nodded, swung back into the saddle, and rode off. Lena stood there for a moment, her hands clenched into fists. She'd paid the bank. She'd saved the ranch. But Crowley didn't care about debts or deeds. He cared about power, and he wasn't going to stop until he had it all. Rhett rode up a few minutes later, his horse's hooves crunching on the gravel. He took one look at her face and dismounted. What happened? Crowley's moving. He cut off the Hendersons' water, ran them off their own land. Rhett's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. He's testing the valley, seeing who'll fight back. Then we fight. That's what he wants. He'll bait you into doing something reckless, then use it as an excuse to bring in the law. Or worse. So what do we do? Just let him take whatever he wants? Rhett was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. No, but we don't fight him head on, not yet. We need to be smarter than that. Smart how? By making him overplay his hand. Lena stared at him. You have a plan. The start of one, but it's risky. Everything's risky. Rhett almost smiled. Fair point. That evening, Lena and Rhett rode to the Henderson ranch. By the time they arrived, a dozen other ranchers had gathered in the Hendersons' barn, their faces grim and wary. These were hard men and women, people who'd carved lives out of rock and sagebrush. But tonight, they looked afraid. John Henderson stood at the front, a tall man in his 50s with a weathered face and calloused hands. His wife Martha stood beside him, her arms crossed, her jaw set. Thank you for coming, Henderson said. I know it's a risk just being here, but if we don't stand together, Crowley's going to crush us all. A rancher named Elias Pruitt spoke up, his voice rough. What do you want us to do, John? He's got money, men, and the law in his pocket. We can't fight that. We don't have to fight him with guns, Lena said, stepping forward. We fight him with proof. We expose what he's doing and make it impossible for him to hide. Pruitt snorted. And how do you propose we do that? By catching him in the act. The room went quiet. Henderson frowned. Explain. Lena glanced at Rhett, who gave her a small nod. She took a breath. Crowley's been careful so far. He uses intermediaries, keeps his hands clean, but he's getting bold. Cutting off water, burning barns, running people off their land. Sooner or later, he's going to make a mistake. And when he does, we'll be there to document it. And then what? Martha Henderson asked. We take it to the sheriff? He's on Crowley's payroll. Not the sheriff, Rhett said quietly. The territorial governor, or a federal marshal, someone Crowley can't buy. Pruitt shook his head. You're dreaming. Even if we get proof, Crowley will bury it, or bury us. Maybe, Lena said. But doing nothing guarantees we lose. At least this way we have a chance. The room buzzed with uneasy murmurs. Lena could see the fear in their eyes, the doubt. These people had families, livelihoods, everything to lose, and she was asking them to risk it all on a gamble. Henderson looked at his wife. She met his gaze, then nodded slowly. All right, Henderson said. We'll try it your way. But if this goes south, Lena, it's on you. I know. Good. Then let's get to work. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Rhett suggested they set up watches on the most vulnerable properties, rotating shifts so no one was left exposed. They'd document everything, every act of sabotage, every threat, every confrontation, and they'd keep it quiet. If Crowley knew what they were doing, he'd change tactics. By the time the meeting broke up, Lena felt a cautious flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they rode home, Rhett was quiet, his eyes on the road ahead. You think this will work? Lena asked. I think it's the best shot we've got. That's not an answer. Rhett glanced at her. You want honesty? I think Crowley's been doing this long enough to know how to cover his tracks. I think he's ruthless and smart and willing to do things we won't. But I also think he's arrogant, and arrogance makes people sloppy. So we wait for him to get sloppy. We wait, and we watch. Lena nodded, though her stomach was tight with unease. Waiting felt like surrender, but Rhett was right. If they moved too soon, they'd lose. So they waited. The attacks came sporadically over the next 2 weeks. A fence cut here, a water hole poisoned there. Small things, designed to drain resources and morale. Each time the ranchers documented it, took notes, gathered evidence. But nothing pointed directly back to Crowley. His men were careful, moving at night, leaving no witnesses. Lena felt the frustration building like steam in a kettle. Every morning she woke up wondering if today would be the day Crowley made his move. And every night she went to bed with the same gnawing fear. Rhett stayed close, working the ranch during the day and riding patrols at night. He didn't talk much, but his presence was steady, grounding. Lena found herself relying on him more than she wanted to admit. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set, Lena finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Why are you really here, Rhett?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I told you." "No. You told me what you wanted me to hear, but I've been watching you. You're not just some drifter looking for work. You're too careful, too controlled. You've done this before." Rhett was silent for a long moment, then he sighed. "You're right. I've done this before." "Done what?" "Fought men like Crowley. Lost to men like Crowley." Lena waited, sensing there was more. "I had a ranch once," Rhett said quietly. "Down in Texas. Small place, nothing fancy, but it was mine. Then a man like Crowley came along, started buying up land around me, squeezing me out. I fought him, tried to do it the right way, through the courts, but he owned the judges, the sheriffs, everyone who mattered. When I wouldn't sell, he burned me out, killed my partner, left me with nothing. I'm sorry." "Don't be. I let it happen. I trusted the system, and the system failed me. I swore I'd never let that happen again." "So you came here to settle a score?" "No, I came here because your brother told me you were worth fighting for, and I wanted to see if he was right." Lena's throat tightened. "And?" Rhett looked at her, and for the first time she saw something vulnerable in his eyes. "He was right." Before Lena could respond, a shout echoed from the barn. They were on their feet in seconds, running toward the sound. Rosa stood in the doorway, her face pale, pointing toward the horizon. "Fire," she said. "At the Henderson place." Lena's blood turned to ice. She and Rhett saddled horses and rode hard, the sky behind them glowing orange. By the time they reached the Henderson ranch, the barn was fully engulfed, flames roaring into the night sky. John Henderson stood in the yard, his face streaked with soot, his eyes empty. Martha was on her knees, sobbing. "They locked the doors," Henderson said numbly. "Locked the horses inside and set it on fire." Lena felt bile rise in her throat. "Did you see who did it?" "Crowley's men, 4 of them. They didn't even try to hide." Rhett's jaw clenched. "Where are they now?" "Gone. Rode north." "We have to go after them," Lena said. "No," Rhett said sharply. "That's what Crowley wants. He's baiting us." "I don't care. We can't just let this—" "Lena," Rhett's voice was hard. "If you ride after them now, you'll end up dead or in jail, and Crowley wins." Lena wanted to scream, wanted to mount up and chase those men down and make them pay. But Rhett was right. This was a trap. She forced herself to breathe, to think. "Then we make him pay another way," she said quietly. "How?" Lena looked at the burning barn, then at Rhett. "By giving him exactly what he wants." Over the next 3 days, Lena and Rhett set the trap. It started with a rumor, carefully planted in town. A prospector passing through had found traces of silver on Lena's property. Not much, but enough to be worth investigating. The news spread fast, fueled by whiskey and speculation. Within 48 hours, Crowley's men were sniffing around. Lena watched from the ridge as 2 of Crowley's hired hands rode onto her land, pretending to check cattle but clearly looking for something else. She let them look. Let them see the freshly disturbed earth near the creek, the markers she'd planted, the tools left conspicuously nearby. The bait was set. 2 nights later, the trap snapped shut. Lena and Rhett waited in the darkness near the creek, hidden among the rocks. 4 men rode in just after midnight, Crowley's men, including Tom Grayson. They dismounted, lit lanterns, and started digging. Rhett signaled to the others. Henderson, Pruitt, and 3 more ranchers moved into position, surrounding the site. "That's far enough," Rhett called out, stepping into the light. The men froze. Grayson's hand went to his gun, but stopped when he saw the rifles pointed at him from all sides. "Smart choice," Rhett said. Grayson's face twisted with anger. You're making a mistake, Calder. The only mistake here is yours. You just got caught trespassing and attempting to sabotage a legal mining claim. There's no silver here. Everyone knows it. Maybe. But you're still on my land, and you're still under arrest. You're not the law. No, a new voice said. But I am. A man stepped out of the shadows, U.S. Marshal Thomas Wade, a hard-faced man in his 40s who'd ridden in from Denver at Rhett's request. He'd been watching from the ridge, documenting everything. Marshal, Grayson said, his voice tight. This is a misunderstanding. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you and your friends broke onto private property with intent to destroy evidence of a mineral claim. That's a federal offense. Grayson's face went pale. Wade looked at Rhett. You have witnesses? 12, all willing to testify. Good. Then these men are coming with me. As Wade's deputies moved in to take the men into custody, Grayson shot Lena a look of pure hatred. Crowley's not going to let this stand. I'm counting on it, Lena said. The trial was swift and brutal. With the marshal's testimony and the evidence from the other ranchers, the case against Crowley's men was airtight. But the real blow came when one of the captured men, a young drifter named Pike, broke under pressure and testified against Crowley himself. He described the bribes, the threats, the orders to burn barns and poison wells. He named names, provided dates, laid bare the entire operation. Crowley tried to fight it. He brought in lawyers, called in favors, leaned on every connection he had. But the federal government didn't care about local politics, and Marshal Wade didn't take bribes. When the verdict came down, Crowley was finished. Convicted of conspiracy, arson, and racketeering, he was sentenced to 15 years in a territorial prison. His assets were seized, his empire dismantled, his name destroyed. Lena stood in the courtroom and watched as they led him away in chains. His eyes found hers one last time, filled with rage and something else, disbelief. He'd never imagined losing, never thought someone like her could beat him. But she had. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining. The air smelled clean. Rhett stood beside her, his hat in his hands. You did it. We did it. He smiled. Yeah, we did. They rode back to the ranch in silence, the weight of the past months finally lifting. When they reached home, Rosa was waiting on the porch, her face lit with relief. Is it over? She asked. It's over, Lena said. Rosa crossed herself, tears streaming down her face. Gracias. Gracias. That night, they gathered in the kitchen. Lena, Rhett, Rosa, and a few of the neighboring ranchers who'd stood with them. They drank whiskey and told stories and laughed for the first time in what felt like years. As the night wore on and the others drifted away, Lena found herself alone with Rhett on the porch. The stars were bright overhead, the air cool and still. What happens now? She asked. You rebuild. Expand the herd. Make this place everything your father wanted it to be. And you? Rhett looked at her, his expression serious. That depends. On what? On whether you want me to stay. Lena's heart skipped. She'd been wondering the same thing, afraid to ask, afraid of the answer. I want you to stay, she said quietly. As a partner? As whatever you want to be. Rhett smiled, slow and genuine. Then I'm staying. They stood there in the quiet, two people who'd fought their way through hell and come out the other side. The ranch stretched out before them, dark and vast and full of possibility. Lena reached out and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. Thank you, she said. For what? For keeping the promise he couldn't. Rhett's grip tightened. It was never his promise to keep. It was always yours. And in that moment, Lena knew he was right. The ranch wasn't just her father's legacy anymore. It was hers. Hard-won, blood-bought, and finally, truly hers. The fight was over. The victory was real. And for the first time since her father died, Lena allowed herself to believe in something beyond survival. She believed in a future. The future Lena believed in lasted exactly 3 weeks. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a fury that caught everyone off guard. The first snow fell in mid-October, heavy and relentless, blanketing the valley in white. The cattle huddled together in the pastures, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The creek turned to ice, and the work of rebuilding became a battle against the cold. Lena stood in the barn, her hands numb despite the gloves, hammering boards into place where the wind had torn them loose. Rhett worked beside her, his movements efficient and sure. They'd fallen into a rhythm over the past weeks, a partnership that extended beyond business into something deeper, something neither of them had quite put words to yet. Rosa brought them coffee at midday, the steam rising from the cups like smoke. "You two are going to work yourselves to death," she said, her tone half scolding, half affectionate. "Better than freezing to death," Lena replied, wrapping her hands around the cup. Rosa shook her head but didn't argue. She'd seen enough frontier winters to know that survival meant constant motion, constant vigilance. You stopped moving, you died. Simple as that. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the ridge. Lena spotted him first, a dark figure silhouetted against the gray sky. Her hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the barn wall. Rhett followed her gaze. "Expecting someone?" "No." They watched as the rider descended the slope, taking his time. As he got closer, Lena recognized him, Deputy Marshal Cole Bennett, one of Wade's men who'd helped with the trial. Bennett pulled up in the yard, his horse's flanks steaming. He looked tired, his face drawn beneath his hat. "Miss Halbrook, Mr. Calder." "Deputy," Lena said, "what brings you out here?" Bennett dismounted, pulling an envelope from his coat. "Official business. Marshal Wade asked me to deliver this personally." Lena took the envelope, her stomach tightening. Nothing good ever came in official envelopes. She tore it open and read quickly. Her face went pale. "What is it?" Rhett asked. "Crowley's attorney filed an appeal. They're claiming procedural errors in the trial, saying the evidence was obtained illegally." Rhett's jaw clenched. "Can they do that?" "They already did," Bennett said. "The territorial court granted a hearing. It's set for 3 weeks from now, in Denver." Lena's hands shook. "So what does that mean?" "It means Crowley might walk. If the court finds in his favor, the conviction gets overturned. He goes free, and all his assets get returned." The words landed like blows. Lena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, the hard-won victory slipping through her fingers. "That's insane," she said. "We had witnesses. We had testimony. Pike confessed. And Crowley's lawyers are arguing that Pike was coerced, that the trap you set constituted entrapment, that Marshal Wade overstepped his jurisdiction." Bennett's expression was sympathetic but grim. "I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying they have an argument." Rhett stepped forward. "What are our chances?" "Honestly, 50-50. Maybe worse. Crowley's got money and connections. He's already brought in one of the best attorneys in the territory. If you want to fight this, you'll need representation just as good." "And that costs money," Lena said flatly. Bennett nodded. "A lot of it." After Bennett left, Lena sat at the kitchen table staring at the letter. The words blurred together, but their meaning was crystal clear. Everything they'd fought for, everything they'd won, was about to be ripped away. Rhett paced the room, his mind working. "How much money do we have?" "Enough to get through the winter. Maybe, if nothing else goes wrong." "Not enough for a lawyer." "Not even close." Miss Rosa set a plate of food in front of Lena, but she couldn't eat. Her appetite had vanished. "There has to be another way," Rosa said. "There isn't," Lena replied. "Crowley's got us boxed in. Even from prison, he's still pulling strings." Rhett stopped pacing. "Then we need to cut those strings." Lena looked up. "How?" "By finding out who's funding his appeal. Lawyers like that don't work for free. Someone's paying them. Someone with deep pockets and a vested interest in seeing Crowley walk." "You think it's another land baron? Or a group of them?" Crowley wasn't working alone. He had partners, investors, people who profited from his schemes. If we can expose them, we might be able to turn this around. Lena felt a flicker of hope. "That's a long shot. It's the only shot we've got." They spent the next 2 days gathering information. Rhett rode into Durango and talked to anyone who'd listen. Saloon owners, clerks, even the prostitutes who worked the cribs near the railroad depot. Money talked, And in a town like Durango, people knew who had it and where it came from. What Rhett learned wasn't encouraging. Crowley's primary backer was a man named Victor Langston, a mining magnate based in Denver with holdings throughout the territory. Langston had invested heavily in Crowley's land acquisitions, using shell companies and proxy buyers to hide his involvement. When Crowley went down, Langston stood to lose millions. "He's not going to let that happen," Rhett said, spreading a map across the kitchen table. "He'll throw everything he has at this appeal. And he's got the kind of money that makes judges nervous." "So we're fighting a man we can't touch," Lena said. "Not exactly. Langston's careful, but he's not invincible. Every empire has cracks. We just need to find them." "And how do we do that?" Rhett met her eyes. "By going to Denver." Lena's heart sank. "That's a 5-day ride in good weather. In this snow, it could take twice that." "I know." "And even if we make it, what then? We knock on Langston's door and ask him nicely to stop trying to free a convicted criminal?" "No. We dig. We find proof of his involvement. We expose the connection between him and Crowley, and we give Marshal Wade something he can use." Lena wanted to argue, to say it was too risky, too desperate, but desperation was all they had left. "All right," she said. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow, before the next storm hits." That night, Lena barely slept. She lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, thinking about everything that could go wrong. They could get caught in a blizzard and freeze to death. They could reach Denver and find nothing. Langston could have them arrested or worse. But staying meant losing. And Lena had fought too hard to lose now. Before dawn, she rose and dressed in her warmest clothes: wool trousers, a heavy coat, gloves, and her father's old hat. She strapped her rifle to her saddle and packed supplies for the journey. Rhett was already in the barn, saddling his roan. He looked up as she entered. "Ready?" "As I'll ever be." Rosa appeared in the doorway carrying a sack of food. "You're both crazy. You know that?" "Probably," Lena said, taking the sack. Rosa's eyes glistened. "Come back safe." "We will." They rode out as the sun broke over the mountains, painting the snow gold and pink. The cold was brutal, biting through their clothes, but they pushed on, following the old stagecoach road toward Denver. The first 2 days were grueling. The snow slowed them down, and twice they had to dismount and lead the horses through drifts that came up to their knees. At night, they made camp in whatever shelter they could find: a stand of trees, an abandoned line shack, once a cave that stank of bear but at least blocked the wind. Rhett proved to be a steady traveling companion, quiet but watchful. He knew how to read the land, how to find the safest path, how to keep the fire going even when the wood was wet. And when Lena's spirits flagged, he was there with a word or a look that reminded her why they were doing this. On the third day, the weather broke. The sun came out, weak but welcome, and the temperature rose just enough to make travel bearable. They made good time, covering nearly 30 miles before nightfall. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Lena finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What if we fail?" Rhett poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "Then we lose, and we start over somewhere else." "Just like that?" "Just like that." "You make it sound easy." "It's not, but it's survivable." He looked at her. "I've lost everything before, Lena. It didn't kill me, and it won't kill you. I don't want to lose the ranch." "I know. But wanting something and keeping it are two different things. All we can do is fight for it. The rest is out of our hands." Lena stared into the flames. "My father used to say something similar. He said the land doesn't owe you anything. You have to earn it every single day." Smart man. He was. But it didn't save him. No. But it gave you a foundation, something to build on. That's more than most people get. Lena didn't respond, but she felt the truth in his words. Her father hadn't left her money or connections or an easy path. He'd left her grit and stubbornness and a refusal to quit. And maybe that was enough. They reached Denver on the 5th day, just as another storm was rolling in from the west. The city was a sprawling mass of buildings and noise, a chaotic blend of wealth and squalor. The streets were crowded with wagons and pedestrians, the air thick with smoke from 100 chimneys. Lena had been to Denver once before, years ago, and she'd hated it then. She hated it now. Rhett led them to a modest hotel on the edge of the business district. They checked in under false names, paid in cash, and went straight to their rooms to wash off the trail dust. That evening, they met in the hotel restaurant, a dim, smoky room filled with miners and businessmen. Rhett had a contact in the city, a former Pinkerton agent named Samuel Cross, who owed him a favor. Cross was waiting for them at a corner table, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a cynical smile. "Calder," Cross said, standing to shake Rhett's hand. "Didn't expect to see you again." "Life's full of surprises." Cross looked at Lena. "And who's this?" "Lena Halbrook. She's the one who needs help." Cross gestured for them to sit. "What kind of help?" Rhett explained the situation, Crowley's conviction, the appeal, Langston's involvement. Cross listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When Rhett finished, Cross leaned back in his chair. "Victor Langston, you're not aiming small, are you? Can you help or not?" "Maybe." Langston's careful, but he's also greedy, and greedy men make mistakes. Cross paused. "I know someone who works in his office, a clerk. She's fed up with the way he treats his employees, might be willing to talk." "For a price," Lena said. Cross smiled. "Everything's for a price, Miss Halbrook. Question is, can you afford it?" "How much?" $200. Half now, half when you get what you need." Lena's stomach dropped. $200 was a fortune, but they'd come too far to turn back now. "Deal," she said. Cross nodded. "I'll set up a meeting. Give me 2 days." Those 2 days felt like an eternity. Lena and Rhett stayed in the hotel, venturing out only to buy supplies and avoid drawing attention. The city felt hostile, every face a potential threat, every shadow a place for danger to hide. On the evening of the second day, Cross sent word. The meeting was set for the following morning at a cafe near the Capitol building. Lena barely slept that night. She kept running through scenarios, trying to prepare for every possibility. What if the clerk didn't show? What if it was a trap? What if they got the information, but it wasn't enough? At dawn, she and Rhett left the hotel and walked to the cafe. The streets were quiet, the city still waking up. Inside, the cafe was warm and smelled of coffee and fresh bread. The clerk was already there, sitting in a corner booth. She was a young woman, maybe 25, with auburn hair and tired eyes. She looked nervous. Lena and Rhett slid into the booth across from her. "You're Miss Halbrook?" the woman asked. "I am. And you are?" "Alice Merritt. Sam Cross said you need information about Mr. Langston." "That's right." Alice glanced around, then leaned forward. "I've worked for him for 3 years. I've seen things, terrible things. He's not just a businessman. He's a criminal. He uses shell companies to hide his assets, bribes officials, and destroys anyone who gets in his way." "Can you prove it?" Rhett asked. Alice reached into her coat and pulled out a small ledger. "This is a copy of his private accounts. It shows payments to Crowley, to lawyers, to judges, everything." Lena's heart leapt. "Why are you giving this to us?" "Because I'm tired of being complicit. I've watched him ruin lives, and I can't do it anymore. But I need your promise. If this gets out, my name stays out of it. I have a daughter. I can't risk losing her." "You have my word," Lena said. Alice handed over the ledger. Lena flipped through it, her eyes scanning the entries. It was all there. Damning, irrefutable proof of Langston's involvement. "This is incredible," she said. "Thank you." Alice stood. "Just make sure it counts." She left without another word, disappearing into the morning crowd. Lena and Rhett sat in silence, staring at the ledger. "We've got him," Lena said finally. "Yeah," Rhett agreed, "we do." They took the ledger straight to Marshal Wade's office. Wade was a hard man to impress, but when he saw the contents, his eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" Lena asked. Wade studied her, then shook his head. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker. "This is enough to bring charges against Langston, and it'll torpedo Crowley's appeal." "Can you use it?" "Damn right I can. I'll take this to the federal prosecutor today. With this evidence, Langston's done, and so is Crowley." Relief flooded through Lena, so intense it made her dizzy. "Thank you." Wade looked at her with something like respect. You've got guts, Miss Halbrook. More than most men I know. I had good help, she said, glancing at Rhett. Wade nodded. Get yourselves home. I'll handle it from here. They left Denver the next morning, riding back through the snow with lighter hearts. The journey home was faster, the weather holding just long enough for them to make good time. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, Lena felt tears sting her eyes. The house stood solid against the white landscape, smoke rising from the chimney. It looked small and fragile and impossibly precious. Rosa was waiting on the porch when they rode up. She ran to meet them, her face wet with tears. You're back. Thank heavens you're back. Lena dismounted and hugged her. It's over, Rosa. We won. Are you sure? I'm sure. That night they gathered around the kitchen table, Lena, Rhett, Rosa, and shared a bottle of whiskey Lena's father had been saving for a special occasion. They toasted to survival, to justice, to the stubborn refusal to break. And as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The appeal was dismissed 2 weeks later. Langston was arrested and charged with fraud, bribery, and racketeering. Crowley's conviction stood. His sentence was extended, and his empire, already crumbling, collapsed completely. The valley breathed easier. The ranchers who'd stood with Lena began to rebuild, their faith restored. And slowly, painfully, the land healed. Lena threw herself into the work of the ranch with renewed purpose. She expanded the herd, repaired the buildings, and negotiated new contracts with buyers in Silverton and Durango. Rhett worked beside her, his partnership evolving into something deeper, something neither of them spoke about but both understood. One evening, as they stood on the ridge watching the sunset, Rhett finally broke the silence. I've been thinking. About what? About staying, not just for the season, permanently. Lena's heart skipped. As a partner? As whatever you'll have me as. She looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope. I'd like that. Yeah? Yeah? Rhett smiled, slow and genuine. Good. They stood there in the fading light, two people who'd fought their way through hell and found something worth holding on to. The ranch stretched out before them, vast and harsh and beautiful. And for the first time, Lena let herself believe it was truly hers. The belief in permanence shattered on a Tuesday in March when spring was just starting to break winter's grip on the valley. Lena was in the north pasture, checking on the new calves, when she saw the smoke. It rose from the direction of the ranch house, a dark column against the pale blue sky. Her heart stopped. Then it started again, racing, pounding in her ears as she kicked her horse into a gallop. The barn was burning, not just burning, engulfed. Flames roared from every opening, climbing the walls, devouring the roof. The heat was so intense she had to pull up 50 yards away, her horse screaming and rearing. Through the crackle and roar she heard another sound that made her blood turn to ice. Horses. Screaming inside. No! Lena threw herself from the saddle and ran toward the barn. Rhett caught her before she reached the door, his arms like iron bands around her waist. You can't go in there. The horses are already dead, Lena. You go in there, you die too. She fought him, clawing and kicking, but he held her fast. She watched helplessly as the barn collapsed in on itself, sending a shower of sparks into the sky. The screaming stopped. And in that terrible silence, Lena felt something inside her break. Rosa ran from the house, her face streaked with tears. I tried to get them out. I tried, but the doors, they were chained shut. Someone chained them. Lena's knees buckled. Rhett lowered her to the ground, still holding her as great wrenching sobs tore from her chest. 4 horses, all of them gone. Bess, her father's old mare, 2 younger geldings, and the colt they'd been training, barely 2 years old. Who did this? Rosa's voice was raw. Who would do this? Rhett's face was carved from stone. Someone who wants to send a message. Crowley's in prison, Lena said, her voice hollow. It can't be him. Not him, but someone working for him, or someone who thinks we're vulnerable now. Lena looked at the burning wreckage, her grief hardening into something cold and sharp. They're right. We are vulnerable. We just lost our transportation, our equipment, everything in that barn. We're crippled." "Not crippled," Rhett said quietly. "Wounded. There's a difference." "Is there?" He pulled her to her feet, his hands on her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Yes, because wounded things can still fight. And you're going to fight, Lena. We both are." She wanted to believe him, but as she stared at the ruins of the barn, all she could see was loss piled on top of loss, a mountain she'd never climb. The sheriff came the next morning, a portly man named Dawson who'd held the position for 15 years through a combination of laziness and willingness to look the other way when convenient. He walked around the burned-out barn, made some notes, and shook his head. "Arson, most likely, but without witnesses or evidence, there's not much I can do." "The doors were chained," Lena said, "from the outside. That's evidence." "Chains melt in a fire, Miss Halbrook. And even if they didn't, that doesn't tell me who did it." "Then investigate. Talk to people. Someone must have seen something." Dawson's expression was sympathetic but empty. "I'll ask around, but I wouldn't get your hopes up." After he left, Rhett stood watching the sheriff's wagon disappear down the road. "He's not going to do anything." "I know. Which means we're on our own." Lena turned to look at him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking someone's trying to finish what Crowley started, and they're not going to stop with a barn." The realization hit her like a physical blow. "They're coming after us." "Yeah, they are." Over the next week, more incidents followed. A section of fence was cut, letting a dozen cattle wander onto Henderson's property. Their well was poisoned, forcing them to haul water from the creek. And one night, someone took shots at the house. 3 bullets that shattered windows and buried themselves in the walls. No one was hurt, but the message was clear. Lena sat at the kitchen table, a rifle across her lap, and tried to think. They couldn't keep living like this, under siege, waiting for the next attack. But they also couldn't abandon the ranch, not after everything they'd fought for. Rhett paced the room, his mind working. "We need to draw them out." "How?" "By giving them a target they can't resist." Lena's eyes narrowed. "You want to bait them." "I want to end this, and the only way to do that is to force their hand. The last time we set a trap, we almost got killed. But we didn't, and we won." He stopped pacing and looked at her. "We can do it again." "What's the bait this time?" Rhett smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Me." Lena's stomach dropped. "No. Listen, whoever's doing this, they're smart. They're not going to get caught unless we make them think they've already won. So we stage an accident. Make it look like I got careless, got hurt. Word gets out that you're alone, vulnerable. They come to finish the job. And then what?" "Then we're waiting for them." Lena shook her head. "It's too dangerous. So is sitting here waiting to die." She wanted to argue, to find another way, but deep down, she knew he was right. They were out of options. "If this goes wrong, it won't. You can't promise that." "No," Rhett admitted. "But I can promise I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe." Lena looked at him, this man who'd appeared in her life when she needed him most, who'd stood beside her through everything. The thought of losing him made her chest ache. "All right," she said finally. "We do this, but we do it my way." "What's your way?" "We don't just catch them. We make sure everyone knows who they are and what they've done. We expose them so completely they can never hide again." Rhett nodded slowly. "I can work with that." They spent 2 days planning. The story they'd spread was simple. Rhett had been thrown from his horse while checking the high pasture, injured badly enough that he couldn't ride. Lena was managing alone, stretched thin, vulnerable. Rosa hated the plan. "This is insanity. You're painting targets on your backs." "We already have targets on our backs," Lena said. "At least this way we control when and where they shoot." They let the story leak through town, a word to the feed store owner, a comment to the doctor when Lena came in asking about supplies for someone with broken ribs. Within 48 hours, everyone in Durango knew that Rhett Calder was laid up and Lena Halbrook was struggling. Then they waited. Rhett stayed out of sight, hidden in the root cellar beneath the kitchen. John Henderson and 3 other ranchers camped in the trees beyond the barn, armed and watching. Marshal Wade had sent 2 deputies to observe from a distance, ready to move in if needed. The trap was set. Now they just needed someone to spring it. It happened on the third night. Lena was in the house reading by lamplight when she heard the creak of a floorboard on the porch. She set down the book, her hand moving to the pistol on the table beside her. The door burst open. 3 men rushed in, guns drawn. Lena recognized one of them, Jake Reese, a hired gun who'd worked for Crowley. The other 2 were strangers, hard-faced men with dead eyes. "Where's Calder?" Reese demanded. Lena stood slowly, keeping her hands visible. "He's not here." "Don't lie to me. We know he's here. We know he's hurt." "He left yesterday. Went to Denver for supplies." Reese stepped closer, his gun leveled at her chest. "You're a terrible liar, Miss Halbrook. And you're a fool if you think you'll get away with this." Reese smiled. "Who's going to stop us? The sheriff? He doesn't care what happens out here." "Maybe not, but I do." The voice came from behind them. Rhett stood in the doorway leading to the cellar, a shotgun in his hands, very much not injured. Reese spun, but before he could raise his gun, the windows shattered. Henderson and his men burst through, rifles trained on the intruders. "Drop your weapons," Henderson ordered. For a moment, nobody moved. Then slowly, reluctantly, Reese and his men lowered their guns. Marshal Wade's deputies came through the front door, taking control of the situation. Wade himself walked in a moment later, his expression grim. "Jake Reese," he said. "Should have known you'd be involved." Reese glared at Lena. "This is entrapment." "No," Wade said. "This is justice. You broke into a private residence with intent to commit violence. That's all the evidence I need. We were hired. We were just following orders." "Then you're going to tell me who gave those orders?" Reese clenched his jaw, but one of the other men spoke up. "It was Langston, Victor Langston. He's still running things from his jail cell. Said if we took care of the Halbrook woman, he'd make it worth our while." Wade's expression darkened. "Is that so?" "I ain't taking the fall for him. He promised us $500 each. Said she was a threat to his business interests." Wade looked at Lena. "Looks like you rattled the wrong cage." "Looks like it," Lena agreed. As the deputies led the men away, Rhett moved to stand beside her. "You all right?" "I will be." Henderson clapped Rhett on the shoulder. "Hell of a plan, Calder. Risky, but it worked." "Wasn't my plan. It was hers." Henderson looked at Lena with newfound respect. "You've got steel in your spine, Miss Halbrook. Your father would be proud." Lena's throat tightened. "Thank you, John." After everyone left, Lena and Rhett stood on the porch, watching the sunrise over the mountains. The air was cool and clean, the sky streaked with gold and pink. "It's really over this time," Lena said. "Yeah, it is. Langston's finished. Crowley's finished. We can finally move forward." Rhett turned to look at her. "Is that what you want? To move forward?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, are you ready for what comes next? Because it's not going to be easy. Rebuilding the barn, replacing the horses, expanding the operation, that takes time and money and backbreaking work." "I know that. And it takes partners, real partners, not just business arrangements." Lena's heart started to race. "What are you saying, Rhett?" He took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "I'm saying I love you. I'm saying I want to build a life here, with you, not just as a hired hand or business partner, but as your husband, if you'll have me." Lena stared at him, her eyes stinging with tears. She'd been so focused on survival, on fighting, that she hadn't let herself think about what came after. But now, standing here with this man who'd given her everything, the answer was clear. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll have you." Rhett's smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. He pulled her close and kissed her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena allowed herself to feel something other than fear or anger or determination. She felt joy. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Henderson and his family came, along with Rosa and a handful of other ranchers who'd stood with them through everything. Marshal Wade even showed up, bringing a bottle of whiskey as a wedding gift. The ceremony was simple, conducted by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. But simple didn't mean it wasn't meaningful. When Rhett slipped the ring onto Lena's finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, she felt the weight of the promise it represented. "I promise to stand beside you," he said quietly, "through drought and storm, prosperity and loss. Whatever comes, we face it together." "Together," Lena echoed. Rosa wept through the whole thing. Afterward, she hugged them both so hard they could barely breathe. "You two are going to be just fine," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know it." That night, as they lay together in the room that was now theirs, Lena felt a peace she'd never known. The ranch was theirs, the threats were gone, and for the first time since her father died, she wasn't alone. "What are you thinking?" Rhett asked, his arm around her shoulders. "I'm thinking about everything we've been through, everything we've survived." "Regret any of it?" "Not a single moment. It made us who we are." Rhett kissed the top of her head. "Then it was worth it." Spring turned to summer, and the ranch came alive. They rebuilt the barn, better and stronger than before. They bought new horses, expanded the herd, and negotiated contracts with buyers as far away as Kansas City. The money started to flow again, not in a flood but in a steady stream that allowed them to plan for the future. Lena threw herself into the work with renewed energy. She was no longer just fighting to survive. She was building something that would last, something she could be proud of. And Rhett was with her every step of the way. He proved to be not just a capable rancher, but a brilliant businessman. He had a knack for reading people, for knowing when to push and when to pull back. Together, they made a formidable team. By autumn, the ranch was thriving. They'd paid off the remaining debts, hired 2 permanent hands, and even started talking about adding another section of land to the north. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lena rested her hand on her stomach, feeling the flutter of life growing inside her. "I think it's time we told Rosa," she said. Rhett looked at her, his eyes widening. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He laughed, pure and joyful, and pulled her into his arms. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." "We are." "When?" "Late winter. February, maybe." Rhett held her at arm's length, studying her face. "How do you feel?" "Scared. Excited. Overwhelmed." "That sounds about right." They told Rosa that night. The older woman cried again, of course, and immediately started planning. She'd need to set up a nursery, gather supplies, make sure they had everything they needed. Lena and Rhett just smiled and let her fuss. Rosa had earned the right to be excited. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Lena was sick most mornings, exhausted by afternoon, and uncomfortable all the time. But she refused to slow down. There was too much work to do, too much at stake. Rhett tried to get her to rest, but she was stubborn. "I'm pregnant, not dying. I can still work." "I know you can, but should you?" "The ranch doesn't stop because I'm having a baby." "No, but you can delegate. Let the hands do more. Let me do more." Lena knew he was right, but letting go was hard. She'd fought so long to keep control, to prove she could do it, that trusting others felt like weakness. But gradually, she learned. She learned to let Rhett handle the negotiations while she focused on the herd. She learned to let the hands take over the heavy lifting while she managed the books. And she learned that asking for help wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. By the time winter arrived, the ranch was running smoothly. They'd had their best year yet, with profits that exceeded even Rhett's optimistic projections. And Lena, despite her growing belly and constant fatigue, felt a contentment she'd never imagined possible. The baby came on a bitter cold night in February. The labor was long and brutal, and there were moments when Lena thought she wouldn't survive it. But Rosa was there, calm and steady, guiding her through. And when it was over, when she held her daughter for the first time, all the pain vanished. The baby had dark hair like her father and Lena's gray eyes. She was perfect. "What are we going to call her?" Rhett asked, his voice rough with emotion. Lena looked down at her daughter, this tiny, fierce thing who'd fought her way into the world. "Grace. We'll call her Grace." "Grace Calder," Rhett said, testing the name. "I like it." "Grace Halbrook Calder," Lena corrected. "She carries both names, both legacies." Rhett smiled. "Even better." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diapers and a kind of exhaustion Lena had never experienced. But they were also filled with moments of pure joy, Grace's first smile, her first laugh, the way she grabbed Rhett's finger and held on like she'd never let go. The ranch continued to prosper. They hired more hands, expanded the operation, and became known throughout the territory as fair employers and honest dealers. Ranchers came to them for advice. Buyers sought them out. And slowly, steadily, the Holbrook-Calder Ranch became a cornerstone of the valley. Years passed. Grace grew from a baby to a toddler to a bright, curious child who followed her parents everywhere, asking questions about the cattle, the horses, the land. She had Lena's stubbornness and Rhett's calm, a combination that promised to be formidable. When Grace was 5, they had a son, a sturdy boy they named Samuel after Lena's father. And 2 years after that, another daughter, Rose, named for the woman who'd held them all together when everything fell apart. The ranch house, once empty and echoing, filled with laughter and noise and life. Rosa aged gracefully, her hair going completely white, her movements slower but her spirit as strong as ever. She doted on the children, spoiling them in ways Lena and Rhett pretended to disapprove of but secretly encouraged. And through it all, Lena and Rhett worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. They argued sometimes, disagreed on strategy, butted heads over decisions. But they never stopped respecting each other, never stopped trusting each other. One evening, when Lena was in her 40s and her children were half grown, she stood on the ridge overlooking the ranch. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and crimson. Below, the ranch sprawled across the valley, barns, corrals, pastures dotted with cattle. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Dogs barked. Somewhere, one of the children was laughing. Rhett walked up beside her, his hair now streaked with gray, lines etched deep around his eyes. "Thinking about the old days?" he asked. "Always." "Any regrets?" Lena smiled. "Not a single one." He took her hand, and they stood there together, watching the light fade. The land stretched out before them, harsh and beautiful, exactly as it had always been. But it didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt like home. "Your father would be proud," Rhett said quietly. "I know. I hope I've honored his memory. You've done more than that. You've built something that will last long after we're gone." Lena squeezed his hand. "We built it. Together." "Together," Rhett agreed. As darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead, they walked back down to the house, where their children waited and the fire burned warm and bright. They'd survived drought and betrayal, fire and loss, threats from men who thought power made them untouchable. But they'd won. Not because they were lucky or blessed, but because they refused to break. Because they fought for what mattered. Because they understood that survival on the frontier wasn't about strength alone. It was about resilience, about partnership, about the stubborn refusal to give up, even when everything seemed lost. The Holbrook-Calder Ranch would stand for generations, a testament to two people who'd gambled everything and won, and their story would become legend, not of luck or providence, but of grit, courage, and a promise kept when it mattered most. Because in the harshest corners of the frontier, survival isn't given. It's earned by those who refuse to break. And Lena Holbrook had never been the breaking kind. The years that followed were not without their challenges, but they were the kind of challenges that came from growth rather than survival, from ambition rather than desperation. When Grace turned 12, she started writing fence lines with her father, learning the land the way Lena had learned it from Samuel. The girl had her grandfather's eye for cattle and her mother's head for numbers. She could look at a steer and estimate its weight within 5 pounds, could calculate profit margins in her head faster than most men could do it on paper. Samuel, at 7, was quieter, but no less capable. He had a gift with horses that reminded Lena of Rhett, a kind of instinctive understanding that couldn't be taught. The animals trusted him in a way they trusted few others. And little Rose, just 5 years old, was already showing signs of inheriting the family's stubbornness. She followed her older siblings everywhere, asking endless questions and refusing to be left behind. The ranch had grown far beyond what Lena's father could have imagined. They now ran nearly 400 head of cattle across 800 acres, employed 6 full-time hands, and had contracts with buyers in 3 states. The original house had been expanded twice, with a proper parlor, a dining room that could seat 20, and upstairs bedrooms for each of the children. But success brought its own complications. One afternoon in late summer, Lena sat in what had become her office, reviewing the books. The numbers were good, better than good, but something nagged at her. Their growth had made them visible, prominent, and prominence attracted attention. Rhett knocked on the doorframe, then entered without waiting for an answer. After 15 years of marriage, they'd long since abandoned such formalities. "We've got visitors," he said. Lena looked up. "Who?" "Representatives from the Colorado Cattlemen's Association. They want to talk about joining." Lena set down her pen. "We've managed fine without them." "I know, but they're not taking no for an answer. Said it's about protection, collective bargaining, things like that." "Things like control, you mean?" Rhett smiled slightly. "That too." The men were waiting in the parlor, 3 of them in expensive suits that looked out of place in a ranch house. The leader was a man named Preston Ashford, silver-haired and smooth-talking, with the kind of practiced charm that Lena had learned to distrust on sight. "Mrs. Calder," Ashford said, standing as she entered. "Thank you for seeing us." "Mr. Ashford, I understand you wanted to discuss membership in your association." "Indeed. The Colorado Cattlemen's Association represents the finest ranching operations in the territory. We've been watching your operation with great interest. Your success has been remarkable. We've worked hard, clearly, which is precisely why we believe you'd be an asset to our organization. Together, we can negotiate better prices with the railroads, influence territorial legislation, protect our interests against Eastern speculators." Lena remained standing, her arms crossed. "And what would this membership cost us?" "A modest annual fee, 5% of gross revenues." Lena's eyebrows rose. 5% is hardly modest. "Consider it an investment. The benefits far outweigh the cost." "What benefits exactly?" Ashford leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Protection, Mrs. Calder. The kind of protection that ensures your ranch continues to prosper. There are forces at work in this territory that would love nothing more than to see successful operations like yours fail. We provide a united front against such threats." The implication was clear, and it made Lena's blood run cold. This wasn't an invitation. It was extortion dressed up in fancy language. "And if we decline your generous offer?" Ashford's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'd be on your own, which, given the challenges facing independent operators, would be unfortunate. Accidents happen, Mrs. Calder. Markets fluctuate. Sometimes ranches that seemed invincible find themselves struggling." Rhett shifted beside her, his hand moving subtly toward the gun he always wore. Lena touched his arm gently, a silent message to wait. "I appreciate you coming all this way," Lena said, her voice pleasant but firm. "But we're not interested in joining your association. We've built this ranch on our own terms, and that's how we intend to keep it." Ashford's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake." "Perhaps, but it's our mistake to make." The men left shortly after, their displeasure evident. When the door closed behind them, Rhett turned to Lena. "That was a threat." "I know. They're going to come after us." "Probably." "And you're still saying no?" Lena looked at him, her jaw set. "We didn't survive Crowley and Langston just to hand over control to another group of thieves. If they want to fight, we'll give them one." Rhett studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right. But we need to be smart about this. These men have resources we don't. Then we find different resources. We've done it before." The trouble started within a week. Their contracts with 2 major buyers were suddenly canceled, no explanation given. A week later, 3 of their hands quit without notice, lured away by offers of higher pay from competing ranches. Then their credit at the feed store was mysteriously cut off. Each incident alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern. Lena called a meeting with Henderson and the other ranchers who'd stood with them before. They gathered at the Halbrook Calder Ranch, their faces grim. "It's the association," Henderson said. "They're squeezing everyone who won't join. I've lost 2 contracts this month. Pruitt's had his water rights challenged. This is Crowley all over again, just with a different name." "So what do we do?" Martha Henderson asked. "We can't fight them all." We don't have to fight them all, Lena said. We just have to prove they're operating illegally. If they're using coercion and intimidation to force membership, that's racketeering. The federal government takes that seriously. You want to go to the law again? Pruitt asked. That worked last time, but we got lucky. These men are careful. They'll have covered their tracks. Maybe, Rhett said. But they also got arrogant. Arrogant people get sloppy. We need proof, Lena continued. Documentation of threats, canceled contracts, anything that shows a pattern of coercion, and we need someone on the inside. Who? Henderson asked. Lena thought for a moment. There's a young rancher named Daniel Cooper, runs a small operation west of here. The association approached him last month. He joined, but I heard he wasn't happy about it. If we can convince him to help us, that's a big if, Martha said. If they find out he's working against them, they'll destroy him. Which is why we need to make sure they don't find out. It took 2 weeks to convince Cooper. He was scared, and rightfully so. But he was also angry at being forced into something he didn't want. In the end, that anger won out. Cooper provided them with documents showing the association's methods, lists of ranchers who'd been threatened, records of payments that looked suspiciously like bribes to railroad officials. It was damning evidence, but they needed more. They needed someone to testify. That someone turned out to be one of Ashford's own lieutenants, a man named Morris, who'd grown disillusioned with the association's tactics. Morris had a conscience, something Ashford had failed to account for. With Morris's testimony and Cooper's documents, they had a case. Lena took everything to Marshal Wade, who was now the territorial marshal and had offices in Denver. Wade looked over the evidence, his expression darkening with each page. This is enough to bring charges, federal charges. How long? Lena asked. We'll need to build the case properly, interview witnesses, gather additional evidence, maybe 6 months. We don't have 6 months. They're bleeding us dry. Wade leaned back in his chair. Then you're going to have to hold on. Can you do that? Lena thought of her children, her ranch, everything she'd built. We can do it. The next 6 months were brutal. The association tightened the screws, cutting them off from markets, sabotaging shipments, spreading rumors about the quality of their cattle. Their savings dwindled. They had to let 2 hands go. There were nights when Lena lay awake wondering if they'd survive this, but they held on. Rhett found new buyers, ones the association hadn't gotten to yet. They diversified, selling directly to mining camps and lumber operations. It was harder work for less money, but it kept them afloat. And all the while, Wade was building his case. The trial began in early spring, held in federal court in Denver. The courtroom was packed, not just with ranchers, but with reporters from newspapers across the territory. This was big news, a test of whether the federal government would stand up to powerful local interests. Ashford and 6 other association leaders sat at the defense table, their lawyers expensive and confident. But as the prosecution presented its case, laying out the pattern of intimidation and coercion, that confidence began to crack. Morris testified first, describing in detail how the association operated, the threats, the bribes, the systematic destruction of anyone who refused to comply. Then Cooper took the stand, providing documents and dates and names. Finally, Lena herself testified. She described the meeting with Ashford, the veiled threats, the subsequent attacks on her business. Ashford's lawyer tried to discredit her, painting her as a bitter woman with a vendetta against successful men. But Lena didn't break. She answered every question calmly, factually, letting the evidence speak for itself. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Ashford and his associates were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. The Colorado Cattlemen's Association was dissolved, its assets seized and distributed to the ranchers it had victimized. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Lena. Mrs. Calder, how do you feel about the verdict? Relieved, grateful that justice was served. You've now beaten 2 corrupt organizations trying to take your land. What's your secret? Lena smiled slightly. No secret, just refusal to give up what's mine. What's next for you and your ranch? We go home. We rebuild. We keep going. And that's exactly what they did. With the association gone, the legitimate cattlemen's organizations that remained became more accountable, more transparent. The industry stabilized, and the Halbrook Calder Ranch not only recovered, but thrived. By the time Grace was 16, she was managing significant portions of the operation herself. She had her mother's strategic mind and her father's calm under pressure. Lena and Rhett began training her not just to work the ranch, but to run it. "You're thinking about succession," Rhett said one evening as they watched Grace work a young horse in the corral. "She's ready for more responsibility," Lena replied. "She's 16. I was running this place at 22, and I didn't have half her preparation." Rhett smiled. "She's something special, isn't she?" "They all are. But Grace, she has that fire, the kind you need to survive out here." Samuel, now 13, had decided he wanted to focus on horse breeding. He'd shown remarkable skill at selecting bloodlines, at training animals that were both strong and intelligent. Rhett was teaching him everything he knew, and the boy was absorbing it like a sponge. Rose, at 10, was still finding her path, but she had a gift for people, a warmth and charm that made everyone who met her feel valued. Lena suspected she'd end up handling the business side of the operation, the negotiations and contracts. Together, the three of them would form a formidable team. Rosa, now in her 70s, had slowed considerably. She spent most of her days in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the ranch bustle around her, but her mind was still sharp, and she was always ready with advice when asked. One afternoon, Lena sat beside her, both of them watching the children work. "You've built something remarkable," Rosa said quietly. "We built it together, you, me, Rhett, all of us." "Your father would be so proud." Lena's throat tightened. "I hope so. I've tried to honor what he started." "You've done more than that. You've turned it into something that will last for generations." "That's the plan." Rosa reached over and took Lena's hand. "I won't be here to see it all, you know." "Rosa, don't. We both know I'm old, and that's all right. I've lived a good life, seen you grow from a scared young woman into this force of nature, watched your children come into the world. That's more than most people get." Lena squeezed her hand, tears threatening. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have survived. That's what you do," Rosa smiled. "But I'm glad I got to be here for it." Rosa died peacefully in her sleep 2 months later. They buried her on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the valley she'd loved. The entire community came to pay their respects. She'd been a fixture in the valley for decades, and her loss was felt by everyone. At the graveside, Lena stood with her family, Rhett's arm around her shoulders, her children gathered close. She thought about all the people who'd helped shape her life. Her father, Nathaniel, despite his failures, Rosa, Marshall Wade, the ranchers who'd stood with her, and Rhett, always Rhett. "She was right, you know," Rhett said softly. "About what?" "About you being a force of nature. That's exactly what you are." Lena leaned into him. "We're a force of nature. Together." "Together," he agreed. As the years continued to pass, the legend of the Halbrook Calder Ranch grew. People spoke of Lena in the same breath as the great pioneering women of the West. Stories were told about how she'd fought off land barons and corrupt associations, how she'd built an empire from the edge of ruin. But Lena herself didn't think much about legacy or legend. She was too busy living, working, teaching her children everything she knew. When Grace turned 20, Lena officially made her a partner in the ranch. The papers were signed in the office that had once been Samuel Halbrook's, with Rhett and the younger children as witnesses. "This is a big responsibility," Lena told her daughter. "I know. I'm ready for it." Lena studied Grace's face, seeing in it echoes of her own determination, her father's steadiness, and something uniquely hers. "Yes, you are." By the time Lena was 55, she'd begun gradually stepping back from the day-to-day operations. Not because she was incapable, but because she trusted her children to carry on what she'd started. Grace managed the cattle operation. Samuel ran a successful horse breeding program that had attracted buyers from as far away as California. And Rose, now 20, handled all the contracts and negotiations with a skill that would have made any businessman jealous. The ranch had become one of the most successful operations in Colorado, a model that others studied and tried to emulate. One evening, 27 years after Rhett had first appeared at her door with an impossible offer, Lena and Rhett sat on the porch watching the sunset. Their hair was more gray than brown now, their hands gnarled from decades of work. But they still held hands like young lovers. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Lena asked, "when you showed up and offered me a partnership?" Rhett smiled. "Every day? Do you regret it?" "Not for a second. You?" "Not for a second." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as their grandchildren played in the yard. Grace had married a good man, a rancher from the next valley, and they had 3 children of their own. Samuel's wife was pregnant with their first. The Halbrook Calder legacy was secure. "We did it," Lena said softly. "What's that?" "We survived. We built something that lasted. We won." Rhett squeezed her hand. "We did more than survive, Lena. We lived. We fought for what mattered. We refused to break when everything tried to break us." "Think they'll remember us?" "The children? Absolutely. They'll tell their children about the woman who stood up to land barons and corrupt associations, about the man who kept his promises when others threw them away." Lena smiled. "That's not a bad legacy." "No, it's not." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch, 2 people who'd gambled everything on each other and won. The ranch stretched out before them, lights glowing in windows, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the sound of family and life and continuity. They'd started with nothing but debt and desperation. They'd faced threats from powerful men who thought they were invincible. They'd endured fire and sabotage and legal battles that could have destroyed them. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd built an empire on grit and determination and the stubborn refusal to yield. And now, as they entered the twilight of their lives, they could look back with pride, not at the wealth they'd accumulated or the land they owned, but at the family they'd raised, the community they'd helped build, and the example they'd set. On the frontier, survival was never given. It was earned through blood and sweat and endless toil. It was earned by those who refused to break, no matter how hard the world pushed. Lena Halbrook Calder had been pushed harder than most. She'd lost her father, her brother, nearly lost her ranch a dozen times. She'd been threatened, attacked, burned out, and squeezed. But she'd never broken. And in the end, that made all the difference. Years later, when Lena passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, with Rhett holding her hand and her children gathered around, the entire territory mourned. Flags flew at half-mast. Newspapers ran obituaries calling her one of the great pioneers of the American West. But the truest tribute came from the land itself. The ranch she'd saved, expanded, and nurtured continued to thrive under her children's stewardship, then her grandchildren's, then beyond. The Halbrook Calder name became synonymous with integrity, resilience, and the kind of stubborn determination that defined the frontier spirit. Rhett lived another 5 years after Lena's death, spending his days teaching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren the lessons he and Lena had learned. When his time came, he was buried beside her on the hill overlooking the valley, their stones side by side, partners in death as they'd been in life. And the story of how a desperate woman and a drifting cowboy had saved a dying ranch and built a dynasty became the stuff of legend. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, passed down through generations, embellished and romanticized until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. But at its core, the story remained true. It was a story about survival in its purest form, about 2 people who'd been given every reason to quit and had chosen to fight instead, about promises kept when it would have been easier to break them, about love forged in fire and tested by time. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving. It crushed the weak and rewarded the strong. But strength wasn't just about muscle or money or power. It was about the courage to stand when everything told you to run, the wisdom to fight smart when fighting hard wasn't enough, the grace to ask for help when pride said to stand alone. Lena and Rhett had embodied all of those things. And in doing so, they'd not only survived the frontier, but had helped tame it, had turned a wilderness into a home, had built something that outlasted them both. In the harshest corners of the frontier, survival isn't given. It's earned by those who refuse to break, by those who understand that the greatest victories aren't won in a single battle, but through a lifetime of small, stubborn choices to keep going when quitting would be easier. Lena Halbrook Calder had made those choices every single day of her life. And in the end, those choices had made all the difference. The ranch stood as proof. Not just a property, but a testament. Evidence that determination could overcome impossible odds, that partnerships built on trust and respect could weather any storm, that the frontier, for all its brutality, still had room for those brave enough to claim their place in it. And so the story ended where it began, with a ranch in the Colorado high country. But this time, it wasn't dying, it was thriving. Home to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of two people who'd refused to let their story end in defeat. Because in the end, that's what survival really meant. Not just staying alive, but building something worth living for. Something worth fighting for. Something that lasted. And the Holbrook-Calder Ranch, born from desperation and forged in fire, would last for generations to come. They diversified, selling directly to mining camps and lumber operations. It was harder work for less money, but it kept them afloat. And all the while, Wade was building his case. The trial began in early spring, held in federal court in Denver. The courtroom was packed, not just with ranchers, but with reporters from newspapers across the territory. This was big news, a test of whether the federal government would stand up to powerful local interests. Ashford and 6 other association leaders sat at the defense table, their lawyers expensive and confident. But as the prosecution presented its case, laying out the pattern of intimidation and coercion, that confidence began to crack. Morris testified first, describing in detail how the association operated. The threats, the bribes, the systematic destruction of anyone who refused to comply. Then Cooper took the stand, providing documents and dates and names. Finally, Lena herself testified. She described the meeting with Ashford, the veiled threats, the subsequent attacks on her business. Ashford's lawyer tried to discredit her, painting her as a bitter woman with a vendetta against successful men. But Lena didn't break. She answered every question calmly, factually, letting the evidence speak for itself. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. Ashford and his associates were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. The Colorado Cattlemen's Association was dissolved, its assets seized and distributed to the ranchers it had victimized. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Lena. "Mrs. Calder, how do you feel about the verdict?" "Relieved, grateful that justice was served. You've now beaten 2 corrupt organizations trying to take your land. What's your secret?" Lena smiled slightly. "No secret, just refusal to give up what's mine. What's next for you and your ranch?" "We go home. We rebuild. We keep going." And that's exactly what they did. With the association gone, the legitimate cattlemen's organizations that remained became more accountable, more transparent. The industry stabilized, and the Holbrook-Calder Ranch not only recovered, but thrived. By the time Grace was 16, she was managing significant portions of the operation herself. She had her mother's strategic mind and her father's calm under pressure. Lena and Rhett began training her not just to work the ranch, but to run it. "You're thinking about succession," Rhett said one evening as they watched Grace work a young horse in the corral. "She's ready for more responsibility," Lena replied. "She's 16. I was running this place at 22, and I didn't have half her preparation." Rhett smiled. "She's something special, isn't she?" "They all are. But Grace, she has that fire, the kind you need to survive out here." Samuel, now 13, had decided he wanted to focus on horse breeding. He'd shown remarkable skill at selecting bloodlines, at training animals that were both strong and intelligent. Rhett was teaching him everything he knew, and the boy was absorbing it like a sponge. Rose, at 10, was still finding her path, but she had a gift for people, a warmth and charm that made everyone who met her feel valued. Lena suspected she'd end up handling the business side of the operation, the negotiations and contracts. Together, the 3 of them would form a formidable team. Rosa, now in her 70s, had slowed considerably. She spent most of her days in a rocking chair on the porch, watching the ranch bustle around her, but her mind was still sharp, and she was always ready with advice when asked. One afternoon, Lena sat beside her, both of them watching the children work. "You've built something remarkable," Rosa said quietly. "We built it together. You, me, Rhett, all of us. Your father would be so proud." Lena's throat tightened. I hope so. I've tried to honor what he started. You've done more than that. You've turned it into something that will last for generations. That's the plan. Rosa reached over and took Lena's hand. I won't be here to see it all, you know. Rosa, don't. We both know I'm old, and that's all right. I've lived a good life. Seen you grow from a scared young woman into this force of nature. Watched your children come into the world. That's more than most people get. Lena squeezed her hand, tears threatening. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have survived. That's what you do. Rosa smiled, but I'm glad I got to be here for it. Rosa died peacefully in her sleep 2 months later. They buried her on the ranch, on a hill overlooking the valley she'd loved. The entire community came to pay their respects. She'd been a fixture in the valley for decades, and her loss was felt by everyone. At the graveside, Lena stood with her family, Rhett's arm around her shoulders, her children gathered close. She thought about all the people who'd helped shape her life, her father, Nathaniel, despite his failures, Rosa, Marshall Wade, the ranchers who'd stood with her, and Rhett, always Rhett. She was right, you know, Rhett said softly. About what? About you being a force of nature. That's exactly what you are. Lena leaned into him. We're a force of nature. Together. Together, he agreed. As the years continued to pass, the legend of the Halbrook Calder Ranch grew. People spoke of Lena in the same breath as the great pioneering women of the West. Stories were told about how she'd fought off land barons and corrupt associations, how she'd built an empire from the edge of ruin. But Lena herself didn't think much about legacy or legend. She was too busy living, working, teaching her children everything she knew. When Grace turned 20, Lena officially made her a partner in the ranch. The papers were signed in the office that had once been Samuel Halbrook's, with Rhett and the younger children as witnesses. This is a big responsibility, Lena told her daughter. I know. I'm ready for it. Lena studied Grace's face, seeing in it echoes of her own determination, her father's steadiness, and something uniquely hers. Yes, you are. By the time Lena was 55, she'd begun gradually stepping back from the day-to-day operations. Not because she was incapable, but because she trusted her children to carry on what she'd started. Grace managed the cattle operation. Samuel ran a successful horse breeding program that had attracted buyers from as far away as California. And Rose, now 20, handled all the contracts and negotiations with a skill that would have made any businessman jealous. The ranch had become one of the most successful operations in Colorado, a model that others studied and tried to emulate. One evening, 27 years after Rhett had first appeared at her door with an impossible offer, Lena and Rhett sat on the porch watching the sunset. Their hair was more gray than brown now, their hands gnarled from decades of work, but they still held hands like young lovers. Do you ever think about that first day? Lena asked. When you showed up and offered me a partnership? Rhett smiled. Every day. Do you regret it? Not for a second. You? Not for a second. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as their grandchildren played in the yard. Grace had married a good man, a rancher from the next valley, and they had 3 children of their own. Samuel's wife was pregnant with their first. The Halbrook Calder legacy was secure. We did it, Lena said softly. What's that? We survived. We built something that lasted. We won. Rhett squeezed her hand. We did more than survive, Lena. We lived. We fought for what mattered. We refused to break when everything tried to break us. Think they'll remember us? The children? Absolutely. They'll tell their children about the woman who stood up to land barons and corrupt associations, about the man who kept his promises when others threw them away. Lena smiled. That's not a bad legacy. No, it's not. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared, they remained on the porch, 2 people who'd gambled everything on each other and won. The ranch stretched out before them, lights glowing in windows, cattle lowing in distant pastures, the sound of family and life and continuity. They'd started with nothing but debt and desperation. They'd faced threats from powerful men who thought they were invincible. They'd endured fire and sabotage and legal battles that could have destroyed them. But they'd survived. More than survived. They'd built an empire on grit and determination and the stubborn refusal to yield. And now, as they entered the twilight of their lives, they could look back with pride, not at the wealth they'd accumulated or the land they owned, but at the family they'd raised, the community they'd helped build, and the example they'd set. On the frontier, survival was never given. It was earned through blood and sweat and endless toil. It was earned by those who refused to break, no matter how hard the world pushed. Lena Halbrook Calder had been pushed harder than most. She'd lost her father, her brother, nearly lost her ranch a dozen times. She'd been threatened, attacked, burned out, and squeezed. But she'd never broken. And in the end, that made all the difference. Years later, when Lena passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 78, with Rhett holding her hand and her children gathered around, the entire territory mourned. Flags flew at half-mast. Newspapers ran obituaries calling her one of the great pioneers of the American West. But the truest tribute came from the land itself. The ranch she'd saved, expanded, and nurtured continued to thrive under her children's stewardship, then her grandchildren's, then beyond. The Halbrook Calder name became synonymous with integrity, resilience, and the kind of stubborn determination that defined the frontier spirit. Rhett lived another 5 years after Lena's death, spending his days teaching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren the lessons he and Lena had learned. When his time came, he was buried beside her on the hill overlooking the valley, their stones side by side, partners in death as they'd been in life. And the story of how a desperate woman and a drifting cowboy had saved a dying ranch and built a dynasty became the stuff of legend. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, passed down through generations, embellished and romanticized until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. But at its core, the story remained true. It was a story about survival in its purest form, about two people who'd been given every reason to quit and had chosen to fight instead, about promises kept when it would have been easier to break them, about love forged in fire and tested by time. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving. It crushed the weak and rewarded the strong. But strength wasn't just about muscle or money or power. It was about the courage to stand when everything told you to run. The wisdom to fight smart when fighting hard wasn't enough. The grace to ask for help when pride said to stand alone. Lena and Rhett had embodied all of those things. And in doing so, they'd not only survived the frontier, but had helped tame it, had turned a wilderness into a home, had built something that outlasted them both. In the harshest corners of the frontier, survival isn't given. It's earned by those who refuse to break, by those who understand that the greatest victories aren't won in a single battle, but through a lifetime of small, stubborn choices to keep going when quitting would be easier. Lena Halbrook Calder had made those choices every single day of her life. And in the end, those choices had made all the difference. The ranch stood as proof, not just a property, but a testament, evidence that determination could overcome impossible odds, that partnerships built on trust and respect could weather any storm, that the frontier, for all its brutality, still had room for those brave enough to claim their place in it. And so the story ended where it began, with a ranch in the Colorado high country. But this time it wasn't dying, it was thriving, home to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of two people who'd refused to let their story end in defeat. Because in the end, that's what survival really meant. Not just staying alive, but building something worth living for, something worth fighting for, something that lasted. And the Halbrook Calder Ranch, born from desperation and forged in fire, would last for generations to come. But the truest tribute came from the land itself. The ranch she'd saved, expanded, and nurtured continued to thrive under her children's stewardship, then her grandchildren's, then beyond. The Halbrook Calder name became synonymous with integrity, resilience, and the kind of stubborn determination that defined the frontier spirit. Rhett lived another 5 years after Lena's death, spending his days teaching his grandchildren and great-grandchildren the lessons he and Lena had learned. When his time came, he was buried beside her on the hill overlooking the valley, their stones side by side, partners in death as they'd been in life. And the story of how a desperate woman and a drifting cowboy had saved a dying ranch and built a dynasty became the stuff of legend. It was told around campfires and dinner tables, passed down through generations, embellished and romanticized until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. But at its core, the story remained true. It was a story about survival in its purest form, about two people who'd been given every reason to quit and had chosen to fight instead, about promises kept when it would have been easier to break them, about love forged in fire and tested by time. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving. It crushed the weak and rewarded the strong. But strength wasn't just about muscle or money or power. It was about the courage to stand when everything told you to run. The wisdom to fight smart when fighting hard wasn't enough. The grace to ask for help when pride said to stand alone. Lena and Rhett had embodied all of those things. And in doing so, they'd not only survived the frontier but had helped tame it, had turned a wilderness into a home, had built something that outlasted them both. In the harshest corners of the frontier, survival isn't given. It's earned by those who refuse to break, by those who understand that the greatest victories aren't won in a single battle, but through a lifetime of small, stubborn choices to keep going when quitting would be easier. Lena Halbrook Calder had made those choices every single day of her life. And in the end, those choices had made all the difference. The ranch stood as proof, not just a property, but a testament. Evidence that determination could overcome impossible odds, that partnerships built on trust and respect could weather any storm, that the frontier, for all its brutality, still had room for those brave enough to claim their place in it. And so the story ended where it began, with a ranch in the Colorado high country. But this time, it wasn't dying. It was thriving. Home to children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried forward the legacy of two people who'd refused to let their story end in defeat. Because in the end, that's what survival really meant. Not just staying alive, but building something worth living for, something worth fighting for, something that lasted. And the Halbrook Calder Ranch, born from desperation and forged in fire, would last for generations to come.